Hello, everyone. Today we're looking at Elizabeth's local government and how she's going to carry out her rule and authority, particularly in the rural areas of her kingdom. Now, we have to remember that the Elizabethan era is a time before modern technology and electricity, the internet, and messages were always relayed by messengers, and they took a very long time to be communicated. So Elizabeth has a bit of a challenge on her hands as to how she's going to monitor these very rural English communities to make sure that her new rules and policies are being followed. Now, your starter is to write down some ideas as to how the British government enforces laws in rural areas today and how this could be a challenge for Elizabeth. So it's sort of a two-part starter. How does our government enforce the laws in rural areas? And how could this be a challenge in the Elizabethan era? So please do your title, your LO, and your starter. When you feel you've got a starter response, go ahead and resume playing the video and we'll take it up. So carrying on with our starter, how does the government enforce laws in rural areas today? And how could this be a challenge for Queen Elizabeth herself? There are a few different ways that the law is enforced and rules are implemented. We have the police, who are stationed in rural areas and urban areas. CCTV really doesn't matter where you are, whether it's urban or rural, CCTV can be installed. Speed cameras, so on stretches of road where speeding is particularly problematic, those can be installed to discourage speeding, but also to apprehend those who are responsible for that infraction. We also have the internet, that's a big one, and the HMRC, who look at collecting taxes and monitoring people's income. So there's loads of ways that law is enforced in rural areas. But looking at Queen Elizabeth, she did not have access to a police force as we know it today. We'll talk about some of the officers that she would appoint in her local governments to try to maintain law at the local level. She certainly didn't have CCTV. Well, there was no electricity and no cameras back then, so that kind of rules out speed cameras as well. Seeing there were no cars, there's no need for a speed camera. The internet, that wasn't really an invention until just after the Second World War and becoming popular in the 1990s. And the HMRC didn't really exist as we know it today. She did have members of her government, mainly the Royal Court and Privy Council, who were responsible for taxation, but not on the scale that we know today. And they certainly didn't have use of the internet to try to track individuals' incomes and taxes. So, as previously mentioned, maintaining order for Elizabeth was going to be a bit of a struggle, simply because of the great distances in between communities in the mid to late 1550s. So, we know that she would have a relatively difficult time making laws that would be carried out all over England simply because she is a Protestant and many people in the country are Catholic. So, automatically, they're going to want to disobey her. Travel was very difficult. It took an extremely long time. There were no road networks as we know them today. Roads were simply dirt, and we know that if it rains, that dirt turns to mud, and it makes it incredibly difficult to travel, especially long distances. It could take days and days and days for messages to reach all corners of England, or even months, depending on how isolated a given community was. Now, just to show you how long it would take for a message to be sent directly from London to us here at Cressex, you'd be looking at about 11 hours of just continuous walking. Now, that wouldn't happen very often where someone would just walk specifically from London to High Wycombe to deliver a message. But what they would most likely do is stop in almost every village along the way, and that way they could then share that message with those villages who could disperse that to the smaller communities around them. So just a quick little refresh on some context. So we have three questions. Who was in charge of England in the late 1550s? Who was setting the rules and the laws? And where is the center of all political power in England? No need to write these down, but just go through each question and in your head, just try to construct an answer as best possible. So pause the screen now, have a think about these three, and when you're ready, you can go ahead and resume and we'll take them up. So, who is in charge of England in the late 1550s? Well, we know Elizabeth is now the Queen. We know she's not going to be particularly popular due to her Protestant faith and the rest of the country predominantly being Catholic. So, who is setting all the rules and the laws? Well, it's not going to be Elizabeth herself, but it will be her government who is setting rules and laws. Remember, she takes advice from her Privy Council and Royal Court before proceeding with any decisions, and any laws will later need to be enacted by Parliament, who often will side with what the Queen has suggested. And our last question, where is the center of all political power in England? It's the Royal Court. That's the center of all political power. Remember, Elizabeth's courtiers were incredibly influential, and it was their job to keep an eye on the Privy Council as well as Parliament. So this graphic here will help to illustrate the various roles that we'll be talking about. Today we'll be looking at the roles of the Lord Lieutenants, sheriffs. We'll be looking at roles of the Justice of the Peace, parish constables, and we've already come across various terms such as Privy Council, Royal Court, and Monarch. Now we can see that the center of all political power isn't the monarch, it's in fact the Royal Court. And the way that we can use this diagram is to see that the parish constables, they report to the Justice of the Peace, who report back to the Privy Council, who report to the Royal Court, and then report back to the monarch. And instructions go in the opposite direction. So the monarch will inform the Royal Court will then instruct the Privy Council will then communicate that to the JPs, and the JPs will then communicate that to the parish constables. So this is just a visual representation of the information that we'll be covering a little bit later. If you would like to hold off on copying this down, I'm going to give you a different version that will look like a pyramid that we will be copying down a little bit later. So as promised, here is our diagram. So at the very, very top, we have the Queen, the Royal Court, and the Privy Council. Next, we have the Lord Lieutenant, followed by the Sheriff, followed by the JPs, and then we have the lesser officers. We have the Parish Constable, the Night Watchman, and the Overseer of the Poor. So please do go ahead and pause the video now to create this same pyramid diagram in your books with each of the following government roles. When you're done, go ahead and hit play to resume. So here we're looking at some of the important roles within Elizabeth's local government. Some of these we've actually looked at in previous slides of this lesson. Well, your job is going to be to create some mind map summaries. Now, you can do this as mind maps, idea webs, spider diagrams, call them what you will, but we're going to be creating a mind map for each of the following individuals using the readings on the following slides. Now, those readings will come relatively thick and fast, so my advice would be to go ahead and listen to that specific reading, pause the video to be able to make your mind map, and then proceeding by playing to listen to the next role in local government.
The Lord Lieutenant was the highest ranking among the royal officials. This job was only available to a wealthy landowner, usually someone who was already a Privy Councillor. Each county had a Lord Lieutenant. They were responsible for maintaining a local military force called a militia, in the event that England was invaded. The Lord Lieutenant was also responsible for supervising the work of the Justice of the Peace. By the 1560s, Lord Lieutenants found themselves with too much work to do and appointed a deputy to assist them. Each county also had a sheriff who was concerned with legal affairs. Their duties included choosing and swearing in juries, transporting prisoners to court for hearings and helping with the collection of taxes. The role of sheriff was very important in the medieval era, and William the Conqueror's sheriffs were well-respected members of the community. Becoming a sheriff meant prestige and influence in the town or village. However, by the 1560s many of the duties of the sheriff fell on the shoulders of the Justice of the Peace or the Lord Lieutenant. Even though the role of sheriff existed, it was largely a symbolic one. The Justice of the Peace was among the hardest working officer in local government. Their main job was to maintain law and order on the local level. Each county had between 30 and 60 justices of the peace, and most were wealthy landowning gentlemen. For this reason, they were unpaid, but viewed the job as their civil duty to help their community. It helped that the role also came with a considerable amount of power and prestige. Their duties included settling minor crimes in court, but extended to the construction of local roads and highways and charity work. They became so busy during Elizabeth's reign they were supported by the parish constable and the overseer of the poor. The parish constable and night watchman were roles equivalent to modern police officers. They were usually held by a tradesman or farmer. These jobs were unpaid and men were expected to hold the job for 1 year. They were both supervised by the Justice of the Peace and given a range of tasks to do, such as patrolling streets at night in search of criminals, maintaining order at pubs and inns, capturing escaped cattle, settling minor disputes and carrying out punishments for minor crimes such as whipping. The overseer of the poor was tasked with collecting local taxes, known as the poor rate, from everyone in the parish. They were supervised by the Justice of the Peace. The overseer of the poor would then take the taxes to the Justice of the Peace, who would calculate its distribution. Armed with a list, the overseer of the poor would then distribute the money as charity to those who needed it most, as advised by the Justice of the Peace. With poverty being a major issue in Elizabethan England, the role of overseer of the poor was incredibly important.
So you've had a chance to listen to all the various roles in local government. These mind maps that we're going to share with you now isn't everything that you could have, but it's some of the most important information that we should have. So looking at our Lord Lieutenant, we should know that he was a wealthy landowner, usually a member of the Privy Council, and that's how he got into the job of being a Lord Lieutenant. There was one stationed in each county, and they were in charge of the local militia and making sure that they were well equipped and trained in the event that England was going to be invaded. They supervised the JPs, also known as the Justice of the Peace, and it was a very powerful and prestigious role to have. Our sheriff, he was always a wealthy gentleman. He was concerned with legal affairs, mainly swearing in juries, transporting prisoners from prison to trial. Most of their work was actually done by the JPs, and their role was largely symbolic. It was a role that in the medieval era was extremely important, and during the Elizabethan era, it was more of just a tradition to keep rather than a very important government role. But it was still very prestigious to have. Let's take a look at the JPs now. So a Justice of the Peace. Again, a wealthy land-owning gentleman. They were between 30 and 60 in each county. They were the hardest working of the local government officers, and their job was essentially to maintain law on the local level. They were unpaid, but remember this was a very powerful and prestigious role to hold within your local community. And they would directly supervise all of the work done by the parish constables and the night watchmen. So we'll look at that role now. So this was not going to be a wealthy man, but a tradesman or a farmer. They weren't rich, but they weren't incredibly poor. They were what we would kind of consider to be middle class today. They were expected to hold the position for 1 year, as it was their duty to their local community. They were unpaid, but they did develop a sense of prestige and importance within their local community for holding this job. They were supervised directly by the JPs. And think of them as the equivalent to a modern police officer. Their job was to kind of just deal with, well, minor crimes. The night watchman would go out at nighttime to make sure people weren't roaming the streets and trying to break into homes. The parish constable was enforcing kind of those local laws and trying to kind of settle minor disputes between people. And our last one, here's our overseer of the poor. He's going to be a member of the local community. He does not have to be a wealthy man to do this job. His job is to collect taxes known as poor rates. He will bring those poor rates back to the JPs, and then he will be instructed as to how to administer these poor rates to people who need them the most. So think of him as essentially giving charity to those who require it. His work is directly supervised by the JP. And his role is extremely important. Poverty was a massive issue in the Elizabethan era, so having overseers of the poor who could do their job reliably was very, very important. So to culminate all the knowledge we've learned about local government, your task is to create a poster advertising a job for any role within local government. So you can choose between the Lord Lieutenant, the Sheriff, JPs, Parish Constables, Night Watchmen, or the Overseer of the Poor. You should include information on your job advert that a potential applicant would want to know. They would want to know about any kind of necessary qualifications, any kind of responsibilities that they'll have, the importance of the work, and any benefits of the job. That could come down to the salary or any kind of prestige that they might come into, as well as an image of the work that they would be doing. So a half or full page is fine. Make sure that it's colored and it's easy to read, and please do share an image of your work via email.